But I now leave my cetological system standing thus unfinished, even as the great Cathedral of Cologne was left, with the crane still standing upon the top of the uncompleted tower. For small erections may be finished by their first architects. Grand ones, true ones, ever leave the copestone to posterity. God keep me from ever completing anything. This old book is but a draught. Nay, but the draught of a draught. Oh, time, strength, cash, and patience.
Hello and welcome once again to the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne.
And we're finally doing it this time. We're finally reading Moby Dick.
And not a minute too soon.
This is your favorite book, I believe?
Yeah, and I've felt that it's my favorite book for such a long time that I can't even remember when I first felt that way. It feels like it's always been my favorite book, which can't be true. It's obviously impossible, but I can't remember when I first read it. I can't remember a beginning, which is weird.
A few years ago, you got some physical proof of your love of the book.
Yeah. People who know me well know I have a tattoo that says "Call me Ishmael" on my arm. And I got it it must be almost 10 years ago now, maybe a little bit less. And it engenders a strange reaction in people. They either go, "Oh my God, I love that book," or they go, "Is your name Ishmael?"
It is a book that people either love or hate, it seems.
Yeah. And I think even people that love it find it bewildering. I think people either find it bewildering and don't know anything about it and are repelled, or they find it bewildering and they love being bewildered.
Yes. I mean, I think that's the category we would fall into.
Oh, yeah.
But before we start talking about that, we wanted to bring up a little note on the question of audiobooks. I've been getting into the habit of listening to audiobooks while reading these books. Often we're doing books that are in the public domain, and there are free audiobooks available from LibriVox, which I will usually link to in the show notes. And also, of course, you can rent audiobooks from your library often, or you can get them through websites, etc. Like, there's lots of ways to do this. And this was interesting because I tried to look for an audiobook for the autobiography of Malcolm X last time around, and there didn't seem to be any available. And I've since found that there was an abridged version made in the 90s, but that just seems like a book that richly deserves an unabridged, modern audiobook version of it. And I hope that the publishers who are listening to this get right on that. I don't know how you go about petitioning for an audiobook of a classic book to be made. There were lots of choices, on the other hand, for Moby Dick, of course.
Almost too many.
There were indeed too many. There's a LibriVox recording, which comes recommended. The version I read was narrated by Anthony Heald, who did a very good job. There's also an interesting ongoing podcast called Whale, 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 where the host, who is a comedy writer who deeply loves the book, brings on a friend. They read out loud a chapter and annotate it along the way. And even pause
here and there. Which is really neat.
It's a really interesting way to go through it. I've only listened to a few episodes of it, but they were very charming and well done.
The ones of that I listened to, I was really struck by the ways in which, how can I put it? It was on the one hand about the book, but it was also about the relationship between the people, the host and the friend, and sort of enacting that relationship through the thing they were reading, which I thought was really a neat approach.
It was a great approach, and that is what all the best podcasts are, in my opinion. Yeah.
And also, I mean, people obviously are really committed to reading this book aloud. There's the Moby Dick Big Read that uses a number of kind of more well-known people to read different sections of the text, but also in New Bedford, and also I think in other locations, they'll have annual kind of reading practices. I don't know if you've looked at any of these. I found one on YouTube, and it was really interesting to see. I mean, it wasn't very good in the sense that I didn't find the readings very compelling and they were very short, but it was really interesting seeing people come up and reading literally like 2 sentences, one after another. It was almost like scriptural. It was almost like this was a devotional act on their part to each read a tiny little fragment of the text. So it wasn't very good, like to listen to as an audiobook would be to listen to. Like if you wanted to hear the text, it wasn't good for that. But it was really interesting to see the people performing something that obviously meant a lot to them.
I'm always fascinated that certain texts get treated this way. Ulysses famously gets an annual read through done in many different ways, but similarly out of a sense of devotion to the text more than I'm going to sit down and encounter this text for the first time listening to it. And it makes me think also about how we talked about the Iliad early on as a text that was ritually recited during religious ceremonies over 3 days. Like, there is a profoundness to the act of coming together and reading aloud a text that a lot of people or a community care for. And it's great to see this book being part of that tradition.
Yeah, I find that we've been talking now and then about performance and oral qualities of literature, oratory, and so on. This has come up again and again. It came up when we were talking about Whitman, when we were talking about the autobiography of Malcolm X. I feel like this is something we're going to keep talking about.
There is also another audiobook version that I discovered, an abridged version that was read by Burt Reynolds. It's really bad. He does it in a really weird, bad Irish accent. Check it out if you're into that kind of thing.
I only heard a couple snippets, but yeah.
So let me start by saying spoiler warnings, I guess.
Though, is there anyone on the planet who does not know how this book turns out?
Well, there were details.
Well,
I will say there
yes
are details
no, right?
about how it turns out that I didn't know.
Because you read it for the first time, right?
I finished it for the first time. I had read about a quarter or a third of it about 10 years ago, maybe less, and really enjoyed it, but life got in the way, and it's a book that is sort of easy to pick up and easy to put down.
It is a book that allows that invites that, I think.
It's also a book that it's probably even more interesting to revisit, as enthralling as it may be on your first read, and there's plenty of reasons why it might be, going back to it with the comfort of knowing the outline of the work as a whole and where you might be in it and where your favorite sections are and where sections that are still a bit undiscovered country for you are. I think that would really add to the experience of reading this novel. I was reading it at a breakneck pace, trying to get it all finished for today's recording, which was fine, but I do now look forward to going back and spending a little bit more time on some of those chapters in the middle.
Yeah, I think it's a book that very much invites you to lose yourself, and the first time you're making your way through it, getting lost is disorienting and kind of worrisome. You're like, wait, what's going on? Where are we? But when it's the second time or the third time or the 10th time, you can just get lost, and enjoy it and take pleasure in it.
Yeah, exactly. So here's the bare bones outline of the plot, just so that we're all on the same page, so to speak. So our narrator, let's call him Ishmael, is feeling emotionally troubled, and he decides that nothing would be better for his soul than to sign up for a several years-long whaling voyage. So he leaves Manhattan, where he's started out, and he heads for the whaling town of Nantucket. And along the way, in a scene that we're going to talk about at length soon enough, he meets Queequeg. Queequeg is a Polynesian harpooner. And the two of them sort of meet cute and immediately get married. And we'll go into that in a bit too. And so they look for a ship that they can both sign up for together, and they settle on the Pequod. The Pequod is helmed by Captain Ahab, who we don't even get to meet until the ship is well at sea. And when Ahab finally emerges from his quarters, he tells the crew that this is no ordinary whaling voyage. They have in fact set out specifically to kill the notorious white whale Moby Dick. The last time Ahab and Moby Dick met, the whale had bitten off the captain's leg, and he's wearing an ivory stump now, and he is monomaniacal in his thirst for vengeance. So while they circumnavigate the world looking for Moby Dick, seeking him, following his traces and trails, the Pequod has a bunch of adventures along the way. They encounter a bunch of other whaling ships, they kill some other whales, they process those whales for their valuable oils and spermaceti waxes and whatnot, and we learn a lot about whales and whaling along the way. But eventually, after many, many hundreds of pages, they spot Moby Dick. And over the next 3 days, they're caught in this epic, ongoing, grueling campaign. On the third day of fighting, Ahab finally throws his harpoon at the whale. The line on the harpoon strangles him accidentally along the way, and he's whisked off the boat. The whale comes up and destroys the Pequod, and everyone on the Pequod dies, and there's just one lone survivor, our narrator Ishmael, who then we know from earlier parts in the book spends the next several years struggling to write down this tale in all its fullness. That's the main framework for the story. But there are a lot of little events that we'll get into that happen along the way. And also, the story is not in many ways the point of the novel.
And you can see that by the fact that whenever anybody tries to make a movie of it, it's just awful. Because if you just take the plot, it's incredibly simple and narrow and tiny in all kinds of ways. And as you were just sort of giving that summary of the plot, I was thinking about this other aspect that I hadn't really thought about much before. For Ishmael, this is the beginning, middle, and end of his story. But for Ahab, this is the last act of another story. And the fact that we're in two very different timelines, and maybe more than two, is one of the really disorienting and also kind of wonderful features of this book.
There's a lot that is disorienting about this book. So we should talk a bit about what it's like to read Moby Dick. as we've been alluding to, the plot is not always foremost on our narrator's mind.
Those long periods of time where there's like no plot. I mean, there's tons of stuff going on and it's interesting and it's vivid and it's beautiful and it's weird. And I love those parts. But the plot, nothing is happening in the plot at all.
Yeah. The plot sort of wakes up again after something like 70 chapters absence. And it's like, okay, we're going to actually finish this book now at the very end. But there's quite a lot of business to attend to in the middle of it to keep people from being, so to speak, bored.
Well, because this is a whaling voyage, right? Where there's a whole lot of doing nothing. Because as opposed to like commerce-based trips, right? Where you want to make the best speed you can and get from port to port. And it's all about like the commercial enterprise. Whaling, you're just hanging out till you find some whales. And then you're really in frenzied action in the time of hunting and killing the whales, and also preparing and extracting the oil and storing it, right? That's a whole long process. And so there's a whole lot of nothing and then frantic activity. And so there's long parts of this book where nothing's happening. They'll pass a ship, have a gam, that's a sort of a conversation between the two boats, or they catch a whale, but otherwise a whole lot of nothing.
And so our narrator fills this time by telling us about whales.
Everything
about whales.
Though he says it's as yet incomplete. It's a system, though, he says, so that if more whales that are not yet known are discovered, they'll fit in the system. So he's not going to tell you everything, but he's giving you a system that accommodates everything, which is even better.
And he starts off with some very basic, what is a whale? Is a whale a fish? What are the different types of whales? Hey, we're only going to be focusing on sperm whales, really. We're going to make fun of people who are interested in Greenland whales. And then he goes further and further in, doing sections on the different body parts of the whale, the skin of the whale, the head, the tail,
the brain,
the genitals. Everything gets its turn. Every part thoroughly gets described.
Well, it's anatomical, right? I mean, that's what when I think about what I love about this book, that's one of the things. I mean, I love encyclopedias. I love dictionaries. I love things. You're nodding, right? I know you love those things too,
absolutely.
Right? And this book gives you an encyclopedic account, a full anatomy, every last detail of the whale, but also the whale stands in for the world, right? In a certain kind of way. So that systematic way of thinking is sort of thing that people either love or hate, I think.
And it's not, of course, just the whale on its own. It's also paintings about the whales, stories about the whales, tales of whales.
Names for whales.
Famous whales. Yeah, exactly. It is how the whale interacts with the world. There's even a chapter on the whiteness of this particular whale, Moby Dick, which is a strikingly white whale.
It's an amazing chapter. But it's about how we know the whale, right? Whether it's visually, whether it's through language, whether it's through coming up close to it, whether it's through seeing a dead whale where you can look at the anatomical parts, whether it's just a glimpse, whether it's a bad painting where you can't even make out what's happening there. And so it's about knowledge, right? I mean, it's about the whale, but the whale is the way that we talk about how we know.
Or how we don't know.
Yes.
Because that's the other important thing.
Yes.
There's a wonderful description of why so many depictions of whales are so wrong. Because whales don't just sit and plop down in front of you and pose. Beached whales don't look like live whales, is the claim being made. And so it's only whalers who get a chance to see them, and they don't stand still for long enough for you to make a good sketch of them, I suppose.
And no, you're in action and they're in action and it's in the course of the hunt and it's right. So what kind of knowledge is that?
So it's always going to be a partial knowledge for that reason. And that's one of the things that both compels the narrator and frustrates him as he tries to write this complete encyclopedic account of something that cannot be fully known. That's one of the ways that this book has been looked upon. People like talking about this book in terms of big themes.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways it is a very philosophical book, right? But it's a book that is at once philosophical and mocks its philosophical impulse.
Oh, yeah.
There's this one really great moment in the chapter, The Masthead, where you get both a really striking evocation of that sense of kind of losing the borders of yourself when you're at sea for a long time and also makes fun of it. I could read a little bit of it.
Sure.
So he describes the experience of being on the watch, looking out for whales and having the frustration of not seeing one. Perhaps there might have been shoals of whales on the far horizon, but lulled into such an opium-like listlessness of vacant, unconscious reverie is this absent-minded youth by the blending cadence of waves with thoughts that at last he loses his identity, takes the mystic ocean at his feet for the visible image of that deep blue, bottomless soul pervading mankind and nature, and every strange, half-seen, gliding, beautiful thing that eludes him. There is no life in thee now, except that rocking life imparted by a gently rolling ship, by her borrowed from the sea, by the sea from the inscrutable tides of God. But Move your hand or foot an inch, slip your hold at all, and your identity comes back in horror. Over Descartian vortices you hover, and perhaps at midday in the fairest weather, with one half-throttled shriek, you drop through that transparent air into the summer sea, no more to rise forever. And so it's on the one hand kind of serious, but it's like over Descartian vortices you hover. It's like this self-mockery. So every time you try to make sense of this experience, this sense of annihilation of the self, and you try to interpret that in the framework of philosophical thought or other kind of human learning, it's ridiculous. It's absurd. And he undercuts that, like he punctures that balloon over and over and over again.
Well, this was the thing I was going to ask. Do you think of this book as a funny book?
Yeah, at times it's like hilarious, right? There's all this like self-mockery and like absurdity and playfulness.
It's slapstick at times. Yeah. We'll get to the scene where Queequeg and Ishmael first meet. That scene is redolent with slapstick and ridiculousness, and many of the early scenes are like this, where just ridiculousness happens.
But also like profound things. Like these are not mutually exclusive for Melville. Like there's serious things happening, and there's this frothy overlay of playfulness and absurdity and self-mockery and sometimes like despair too. Like all these things are happening.
Absolutely, which is one of the reasons why I quite like the book, because that is the easiest way to get my eyes to be teary is for seriousness to be in the middle of comedy. So this formula, this approach of thinking of let's write a slapstick and have it be deadly serious at the same time really works. Does that mean, by the way, that I was laughing out loud while I was reading this? Not really, but I definitely was like, oh, that's a weird thing to do. That's a funny scene. And I also thought this about the encyclopedic sections, because I felt like there was a sense in which they are there in part because it's funny to keep having them.
Yeah, it's absurd, right?
This is not how novels are supposed to go, but sure, let's spend a few pages talking about the skin of the whale.
Yeah, and and no wonder readers and critics were completely befuddled by this book. I mean, we didn't mention this at the outset, but it's fascinating to notice that, it came out in 1851, but critics were like, what is this? Like, what is going on here? Like, what does this book think it's doing? There were some moderately positive reviews, but by and large, it sank like a stone. And it wasn't until the early part of the 20th century, just after World War I, that all of a sudden people are like, oh, this is a really great book.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to touch upon was that these encyclopedic chapters, as we're calling them, they can feel to the first-time reader very arbitrary, but it did seem like they were very often setting up or working in tandem with the quote-unquote plot chapters that were happening on either side of them, that you'd have some investigation into the innards of a whale, and then in the next chapter some plot event would occur that would be dependent upon knowing a bit more or thinking or having in mind that aspect of whale anatomy.
That's a really good point. I think you're absolutely right. There's in these chapters upon chapters upon chapters that are about the the inside of the whale's head where the sperm oil is, right? The Heidelberg ton, he calls it. Or the skin of the whale, which is like isinglass or mica, where you can see through it, and it's so fine, and it's so thin, it's almost like a lens, he says. He gets this incredible pleasure out of using the whale's skin as if it were a magnifying glass.
As a bookmark, which he then can use as a magnifying glass.
It's so trippy, right? But as you say, what is the effect of those chapters? Like, they're ridiculous, they're fascinating, they're bizarre, they're absurd, but they also give you the knowledge, something like the knowledge you might have if you were on a whaling ship, right? You understand what that part is, or what that part is, or what the work is that the crew is doing. So it's giving you knowledge you need, but not in this expository backstory annotation kind of way. Instead of these exuberant, bizarre, super abundant and flowery passages about whaliness.
Although it's interesting, and we'll get into this in a bit, I imagine, but it's interesting to think about whether our narrator, whether Ishmael, has picked up this knowledge, this specific encyclopedic detailed knowledge about whales before or after his voyage.
Well, he described himself as having gone to sea in the past, right?
He'd gone to sea in the past
more than one.
As a merchant, on one of these trading ships, but this is his first time and perhaps only time going out on a whaling ship. Now, Melville himself did go out on a whaling voyage, and maybe you know more about Melville's biography than I do.
I can give a really quick, brief account of it. He's brought up in a New York family that is kind of got a distinguished lineage, especially with regard to like Revolutionary War history and stuff, but they fall on hard times, and his family is really broke by the time he's a teenager. And he has to keep dropping out of school over and over again to do other kinds of work, whether it's to sort of manage some business for the family or whether it's to serve as a school teacher himself when he was no older than the kids in his class. But when he's 19, he goes to sea for the first time as a cabin boy to England, right, to Liverpool. And then when he gets back, he embarks upon a whaling ship, and he's off on that ship for 4 years, or at least he's away for 4 years on the ship part of that time, sailing in the South Seas. He ends up in Hawaii, and he finds his way back on a regular U.S. military frigate. And so it's not all that many years total. It's like 6 years, right, of voyaging on the seas. But it clearly has a tremendous impact on him because he goes on to write a whole series of novels early in life about that life, which are in some ways very narrative and give you what is in some ways, I guess, a very fact-based kind of account of what you experience in those environments. But they're increasingly fanciful, and people would say, not meaning any compliment by it, philosophical. So by the time he writes Moby Dick, he's like deep in this space where on the one hand, it's about the real world. On the other hand, it's totally metaphysical.
Yeah, I was curious about this because I haven't read any of Melville's other novels, and my understanding is that they are not really like Moby Dick.
Yeah. No, I mean, the earlier ones are all like sort of very much like sort of voyage adventure kind of based. There's one he writes a little bit earlier, Marty, that is sort of moving toward that kind of fantastical impulse. And then after Moby Dick, he writes one more novel, but he's not getting anywhere with it. He takes a journey to the Holy Land, right, to go visit Jerusalem and so on, which obviously has this huge impact on him. He comes back, and what he mostly writes in the whole latter part of his life is poetry. Except he also leaves behind this one work, Billy Budd, which he didn't quite finish and was published after his death. And that's a piece of work that is in some ways obviously totally different from Moby Dick, but that kind of metaphysical, biblical substrate that you feel in parts of Moby Dick, that's there in a really vigorous way. Anyways, he finishes out his life. He's living out in the country. It doesn't work out too well for him when he writes Moby Dick, and then he eventually finds his way back into New York. And he spends his last period of life working in the customs house in New York City, like as a failure, basically, right? He's mostly broke. They're living on his family inheritances, bits and pieces. His wife moves away. He's clearly a mess. Both of his sons die, right? One by a self-inflicted gunshot wound, whether on purpose or not. Another one from tuberculosis. It's like bad.
Yeah.
And so he dies in a bad way. And I feel so much poignancy around that. Like he must have known he'd written something extraordinary, but nobody else knew it.
Well, let's start digging into the book by looking at some of its main characters. And we've already talked a bit about Ishmael, our narrator, and our main guide through this world. So here's a question. Do you like Ishmael?
I feel completely at home with Ishmael. Like that opening, it's so powerful, right? When he's like, why he goes to the sea. He describes, it's like a really famous passage, right? It says, call me Ishmael. Some years ago, never mind how long precisely, having little or no money in my purse and nothing particular to interest me on shore, I thought I would sail about a little and see the watery part of the world. It's a way that I have of driving off the spleen and regulating the circulation. Whenever I find myself growing grim about the mouth, whenever it is a damp, drizzly November in my soul, whenever I find myself involuntarily pausing before coffin warehouses and bringing up the rear of every funeral I meet, then I account it high time to get to sea as soon as I can. This is my substitute for pistol and ball. In other words, I go to sea instead of blowing my brains out.
Right. Yeah.
Is what he say. And I think for many of us, right, we felt like close to despair. And whether it was motivated by a specific event or if it's just a sense of like alienation, you're looking for annihilation. And so for any of us, I think who felt that opening passage is super powerful because you're like, oh yeah, okay, we'll go to sea.
Yeah,
and it takes you in this other world where annihilation is always on the horizon.
Yeah, there's a sense in which that is not the choice I would make.
No.
But I know what that feeling is like, and I know what it means to make a choice that is not what other people would make in that situation.
It's when you want to lose yourself. I mean, I think a lot of us have felt that, right? You want to lose yourself somewhere.
Oh, yeah.
And what happens to him transforms him. I always think it's so interesting, that evocation of the coffin warehouses and the opening lines of the narrative. He's going to be saved by a coffin.
Yes. Spoilers.
Yeah, well, I mean,
We'll get to that pretty soon.
Yeah. And also, when he's at the Spouter-Inn, which is the place where he's going to get married to Queequeg, right, in ways we're going to talk about, the landlord is called Peter Coffin. right? So the coffin is a thing. It's like, I don't know what to call it. It's like a TARDIS. It's this thing through which you pass and which saves you and annihilates you. It's like a womb and a tomb, right? It's like both of these things. It's very strange.
Yeah. Melville and or Ishmael are not shy about imbuing objects and people with heavy amounts of symbolism. And that's usually the way this gets read by high school readers or things like this is, what is the white whale? The white whale stands for this and the coffin stands for this. And it's because he amps this up in the text. Like he's not coy about this.
No.
In that podcast, Whale, 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 that I mentioned earlier, Kevin Flynn, the host of it, in one of the early episodes, refers to Ishmael as being a lot like Frasier, the sitcom character. And that really informed my reading this time through. And I found it absolutely apt. It's somebody who is drunk on words and wishing to be something other than who he is and trying to escape himself in that way. So he falls in love with the idea of himself as a whaler. And he is taking on that identity before he's stepped on a whaling boat. And after he's the lone survivor of it, he spends many years reading up on whales and gathering quite a lot of information from books about whales, because in many ways, books are more his home than the whaling vessel. And this gets reflected in the way that he talks about things. He's constantly using this over-the-top vocabulary to describe everything and constantly trying to systematize things and have his grand plan and make everything grand that he sees grand. He's trying to find language that fits the grandeur of these lowly whalers, of these perceived lowly whalers, which he honestly does still sometimes think of as a bit lowly.
Yeah. No, that's right. I mean, it's grandeur, but it's also like mystery, right? Like when he talks about the whale skin, for example, the hieroglyphics of the whale skin, it's almost like there's mystic characters on them. This is not too long around after the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, right?
Right.
So this idea that there's this mystery key, like you could understand a whole other world that's hidden if you could just find the way in, right? That's the kind of thing that's imminent so much through the whole book. And in some ways, yeah, I mean, I think obviously Ishmael is like kind of clueless, right? But I find it hard not to believe in that. Like I find it hard not to be open to wonder, right? So, even though, so there's all these things that are wrong with Ishmael, but that quality, that open-eyed kind of approach to things, I can't help feeling very drawn in by that.
Well, exactly. And I think that at least for some people, one way to get to that kind of mystical vision of the world is through laughing at that mystical vision of the world. Because it's people who are too jaded for actually reading an earnestly, dry, so to speak, mystical text about the world might find an entree into that way of thinking through this ironic narrator. He very rarely shows up with Ahab. Even when he is literally there, he doesn't mention that he's there.
Well, because he's like a lowly underling. When you were saying before about how like Ishmael and Queequeg go to sea and stuff like that. I mean, Queequeg is valuable. He's a harpooner, right? He is valuable on shipboard. And when the two of them initially go to sign up with the two Quaker ship captains who are going to take them on board the Pequod, that's how they get selected to go, is Queequeg throws his harpoon and strikes a little point he's gestured at. And the captains are like, check, okay, you guys are on board, right? Immediately one. And Queequeg won't come without Ishmael. Ishmael gets like some incredibly pathetic, salary level or lay because he doesn't know anything.
Yeah.
He's riding on the coattails of Queequeg.
And also the bosses are cheapskates.
Oh, yeah, so much so.
So I guess we should talk about Queequeg as well.
Yeah. It's a complicated thing, right? Because it's a book that emerges not just from the 19th century, but from a period of time a little bit after the Great Compromise, right? The years before the Civil War. The U.S. is in a really, really, really awful place with regard to slavery and how it's tearing apart the nation. Right? I mean, it's not going to be talked about in those political terms at all, right? But you can't help but read every depiction of ethnic and racial difference in this book through the lens of what's going on in the United States around that time. And Queequeg is not an American, right? I mean, he is from another part of the world. He is a prince, right? Ishmael tells us where he comes from. And just the same way the Tsar Peter, went to sea in order to learn a lot of stuff when he was a young man that he could bring back to better his country. So too Queequeg, he says, has gone out to explore the wide world, by being on whaling ships. But where we are in time, we integrate our understanding of Queequeg and the ways in which he interacts with Ishmael in a system of race and racialization. And so on the one hand, we read it that way. And on the other hand, it's being undercut or punctuated in all kinds of strange ways in that relationship, that marriage between Ishmael and Queequeg.
This gets dealt with in a very swift and funny way when they meet at the Spouter-Inn.
Well, they have to sleep together.
They have to sleep together. There is, the Spouter-Inn is the only reputable, only tolerable inn.
I don't know about reputable, but like,
It's the only tolerable inn that Ishmael can find in New Bedford. And he arrives and the proprietor, Mr. Coffin, says,
I got no bedroom for you.
And he goes out of his way in a very slapstick way to plane down a bench that might serve as a bed, but it's entirely the wrong shape. And finally, it's just like, well, your one option is that you could share a bed with somebody, which, our Frasier is way too uptight about doing, maybe for good reason.
It's a class thing, right? Like people would share beds. I mean, that is not a strange thing, but he's a little too, Well, first of
precious.
all, he's a little too precious for that, right?
And also, the harpooner is nowhere to be found.
Yeah, I know. He's out late that night, and the innkeeper's like, well, he may not even come in. Who knows what time he'll come in? Don't worry about it.
And when asked what's taking him so long, the innkeeper says, well, he's out selling his head, which leads to a big comedy of errors that they go back and forth. Because he's selling a shrunken head that he's picked up on his travels, which is cracked, which, again, Melville loves all these portentous objects. But eventually, Ishmael says, all right, well, I'm just going to bed, and we'll deal with this when we deal with it.
And then he's totally freaked out.
Well, Queequeg shows up, and Ishmael sees him. And there's a series of beats in this unfolding where he sees different aspects of him. Mm-hmm. So he's a huge harpooner. Mm-hmm. That's already kind of shocking. He's going to take up the whole bed, I guess. Then he sees that he is tattooed. Mm-hmm. And this is terrifying because he doesn't first realize that they are tattoos, but then he has heard of tattooing that goes on. And
it takes him a while to read Queequeg's body. Right?
Yeah, it takes him a long while because after he's read the tattoos and understood them, he thinks, well, this does sometimes happen.
He's like, I have a frame of reference for this.
Yeah. Sometimes white sailors get tattooed by the locals against their will or whatever. And so this must have happened to him. But then he realizes that he is in fact quite dark-skinned, which I guess it is like dark in the room at that point. And maybe this makes sense that it would take so long for him to realize this. But that is the third beat when he realized that, no, this is somebody who is completely alien to my frame of reference of people. Even though I have some book knowledge of this, I have not encountered somebody who looks like Queequeg, and it freaks him out. In several stages, it freaks him out.
And then there's language. That's another barrier that happens after that, right?
Yes, because Queequeg speaks a heavily accented English.
Like a pidgin.
In a kind of pidgin, yeah.
And the innkeeper has to actually kind of, not translate exactly, but to kind of be a go-between in terms of explaining Ishmael to Queequeg and Queequeg to Ishmael.
Yeah,
but as soon as that all happens, as soon as the innkeeper's been in there to kind of make them legible to one another, then they go to bed.
Yeah, then it's fine.
Yeah. And they're like besties, like immediately.
Well, Queequeg is besties immediately.
That's true.
And Ishmael decides to go along for the ride without fully realizing or fully admitting to what ride he's on, even though Queequeg seems to be fully aware of this. This is one of those interesting moments where, well, why don't you read the passage? Yeah,
well, it's a strange, it's a moment where it's kind of funny and bizarre, but it's also an awful lot going on there. So this is when he's waking up in the morning. He said, upon waking next morning about daylight, I found Queequeg's arm thrown over me in the most loving and affectionate manner. You had almost thought I had been his wife. The counterpane was of patchwork, full of odd little party-colored squares and triangles, and this arm of his tattooed all over with an interminable Cretan labyrinth of a figure, no two parts of which were of one precise shade, looked all for the world like the strip of that same patchwork quilt. Indeed, partly lying on it as the arm did when I first awoke, I could hardly tell it from the quilt, they so blended their hues together, and it was only by the sense of weight and pressure that I could tell that Queequeg was hugging me. On the one hand, it's a really silly passage, right? Loving and affectionate, you'd almost thought I'd been his wife, I mean, it's meant to be playful, but it's also like weird, they're like husband and wife. And this language gets used over and over again through that chapter and again later on.
Well, this is the thing. This is played off as a joke at first.
Yeah, but
the joke never leaves.
No, they stay super close.
Even a little bit later in that chapter, as he's still, trying to wake up, for though I tried to move his arm, unlock his bridegroom clasp, yet sleeping as he was, he still hugged me tightly, as though naught but death should part us twain.
Which in fact is what happens, right?
Which is indeed what happens. Well, perhaps. and then even more so, there's a section where Queequeg explains that they are now married.
Like in his law.
Yeah, which
Ishmael says means really that
we're bosom buddies. But
Only not.
Is that what that means?
No, I know. It's the strangest thing, right?
Yeah. Well, maybe. It's an unexpected thing, and it's played in this really knife's edge kind of way. But if you've already set up Ishmael as somebody who is not always the most reliable interpreter of what's going on, and Queequeg as somebody who is blunt and honest and forthright about his...
And effective in everything he does.
Yeah. Effective and affective in many ways. His emotions are on his sleeve. Then who are you going to believe when they say they're married?
Yeah, and it's precisely Queequeg being not white that allows this to happen, right? We wouldn't see this relation. Like you couldn't play this out in the novel in this way, I don't think, without that mutual intelligibility, non-intelligibility. In other words, it's because there's a certain amount of lack of clarity, right? Which one is giving the more accurate or, reliable appraisal of the relationship, right? It's because there's that ambiguity that we can inhabit this like really strange space where they're both of those things, right? They're together.
And you can imagine Ishmael writing this account many, many years later in a very different context as a very different person, and in the 19th century, not really having the language to describe or the ability or the will or the context to really put down what was going on and using this, Queequeg, he's a simpleton. He says we're married. Ha, 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 ha.
Yeah, right.
That's his get out of jail, get out of the closet free clause.
Yeah, well, that's right, right? So that's all happening there. So there's an awful lot to unpack in that relation. But then beyond that, in that scene with the counter, and the chapter's called The Counterpane, right? It's the cover, right? And there's a lot to unpack just in that very title, right? It's a cover. Yeah, it's the bedspread, right? But it's also like coverings. Like we hear about veils and skins and integuments and outer layers over and over and over again. And that's about knowledge, right? But so when Queequeg's arm is on the patchwork, Ishmael describes having this experience where he can't tell the arm apart from the cover. So he's both embraced by Queequeg and also kind of covered by him, right? And the sense of the boundaries of the self is all blurry. And he explains that by talking about this weird experience he'd had way back when he was a child, and he got in trouble and was sent to bed in the afternoon to stay there through to the next morning. And he describes falling asleep and then waking up and having this horrible experience. And he juxtaposes these two moments in a way that gives a kind of awful gravity and breadth of reference kind of to what's happening there with Queequeg. It's like he says, I opened my eyes and the room was dark. Instantly, I felt a shock running through all my frame. Nothing was to be seen and nothing was to be heard, but a supernatural hand seemed placed in mine. My arm hung over the counterpane, and the nameless, unimaginable, silent form or phantom to which the hand belonged seemed closely seated by my bedside. I lay there frozen. And he describes being puzzled by this experience at the time and being puzzled by it long after, where it's his hand, but he doesn't know it's his hand. Like it's him and it's not him. And that remembered experience juxtaposed with the experience of the Queequeg kind of tells us, like, where's the self? Where's the end of the self? And it's about the relationship of Ishmael and Queequeg specifically, but it's also about all of us, right? Where do we begin? Where do we end? We've been thinking about this book in the American cluster, and that whole question of where do I begin and where do I end seems to me to be very much part of that whole conversation. He brings that out already in this very odd kind of way right up front, and then it will come out again in other chapters, like, for example, when they're squeezing out the sperm, right, hand in hand. Again, that sense of where's the end of you and the beginning of me, and the end of me and the beginning of you. These moments are like, what is going on there?
Well, what's going on in the chapter where their hands are plunged in vats of milky sperm.
Yeah.
And they're squeezing and losing themselves in ecstasy, and they're floating in this revelry of manly brotherhood together, and they share knowing looks like.
Yeah, but it's both of those things, right? Like on the one hand, like it's comic and it's absurd and it's like highly sexualized and it's like this weird speakable and unspeakable eroticism. But it's also the self, right? It's and this is the weird thing. I don't think a lot of people can do that, like balance that, that you're in the world of the flesh and in the world that's totally metaphysical at the same time. Or it's like one of those images you look at, it looks like one thing from one side and one from the other. He does that. I don't know anybody else who does that.
Yeah, no, that passage, which comes fairly late in the book about squeezing the sperm, is remarkable in that, and also in the way that he's tying together the comedy and eroticism and this mystical sense of union and
it's like paradise, right?
Yeah.
And he can have you in both of those worlds at one time.
And it's really dependent upon Ishmael being the kind of character who can write out several chapters about squeezing sperm and have it be super sexual, but also have it seem like he didn't intend that.
No, because he's at once an incredibly learned and incredibly naive subject.
Yeah.
You could see him either way, depending on what the moment is requiring. And maybe it's that distinction between what you were saying before, young Ishmael and Ishmael looking back, right? Ishmael looking back presumably understands it, or maybe understands it differently.
And then also what Melville is trying to do through Ishmael, which adds another layer of complication into this mix of identities and selves and so forth. One of the things I didn't know about how this book ends requires a bit of plot setup, and I'm going to rush through it. At some point, Queequeg falls sick. He's feverish and he's basically on his deathbed.
He's sure he's going to die.
He's sure. Everybody is sure he's going to die. And he doesn't want to be cast off in a hammock.
Yeah, normally you'd just be sewn up in your hammock and thrown overboard.
He doesn't like that. His culture's tradition is to be sent into a canoe. And he's seen that back in Nantucket, that when people die, they're put into canoes, which is how he is reading coffins. So he asks for a canoe to be made for him. And they make it, and he's on death's door, and he decides to try it out to see what it's going to be like. And he gets into it, and then he changes his mind and decides not to die. Sure, because he's Queequeg, he can do that. So not planning on using this coffin anytime soon, Queequeg then decides to decorate it with his tattoos. So he makes the coffin look like himself. A bit later, there's a man overboard, and a lifebuoy is thrown out to him, but both the man and the lifebuoy are lost to the sea. And they decide that they need a new lifebuoy, and Queequeg eventually suggests that they use his coffin to convert it because it will float. So they turn it into a lifebuoy, they pitch it up, and they seal it and so forth, so it's a floating vessel. Fine. The very end of the novel, when it's revealed that Ishmael was not on the Pequod as it sank, but was actually still in the ship that he'd gone out with Ahab.
One of the boats that goes out to chase the whale, he had been recruited to be in the back of that boat because somebody else was displaced. And he accidentally gets tumbled out at some point before Ahab's death. And
the only thing after the Pequod sinks to emerge is
the coffin,
the lifebuoy, which he then stays on for several days until another ship saves him. I did not know that this book ended. Like, I knew a lot about this book. I knew that they didn't succeed in getting the whale, but I did not know that the book ended with an image of Ishmael holding on to the coffin decorated like Queequeg.
Yeah.
That Queequeg had offered up to be somebody's salvation at some point, that he ends the novel holding on to his spouse, so to speak.
Yeah, in the way his spouse was holding on to him.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so weird. I'd never thought of it that way. That's so cool.
It's such a love story, this book.
Yeah, no, it is. At the beginning and the end, right? Line up.
Yeah. And while in the middle of it, you don't get a lot of interaction between Queequeg and Ishmael. There's definitely one scene where they're hoisted together in this way where if one of them perishes in this dangerous thing, the other one will go with. And
they're clearly together through the
They're
whole
clearly together. What the details of that are, whether they're sharing bunks ever, who knows? That's not talked about. And a lot of this book is a kind of love story that can't be talked about.
That's right.
So it comes up in these weird bursts and these weird spoutings, but is never fully engaged with. But it's just there from the beginning to the end. That's how the book begins. That's how the book ends. We should probably also talk a bit about Ahab.
Yeah. Well, we were talking before about how the extent to which sort of there's biblical points of reference over and over again. And sometimes that's like turns of phrase that we'll recognize, right? Even the very idea of Leviathan, right? The whale is this kind of monster of the deep, right? Or the Jonah story. Like there's all these different points of reference, but characters are named after figures in the Bible and not like super mainstream figures, right? In the case of Ahab and Ishmael, right? These are well-known stories, but they're not the main stories. And so Ishmael is an outcast, right? An alternative to Isaac, right? He's the one who's not the chosen son of Abraham. And Ahab is this incredibly degenerate king, right? And they have a conversation about his name actually well before we ever meet Ahab, when Ishmael is just coming on board the Pequod to seek out a place for him and Queequeg at the first time. Ishmael is immediately kind of put off when he learns Ahab's name, but the captain who's signing him and Queequeg up for the Pequod says you can't blame him for this. He says, Captain Ahab did not name himself. 'Twas a foolish, ignorant whim of his crazy widowed mother who died when he was only a 12-month-old. And yet, he says, the old squaw Tistig at Gayhead said that the name would somehow prove prophetic. And he goes on, it's a lie. I know Captain Ahab well. I know what he is, a good man. He might be a little bit out of his mind, but, it's the pain from the leg. And the captain goes on to say, ever since he lost his leg last voyage by that accursed whale, he's been kind of moody, desperate moody, and savage sometimes. But that'll all pass off. I'm like, that's alarming, right? So on the one hand, you can't blame him for his name, but on the other hand, there's all this stuff that can't be told, can't quite be talked about.
Yeah, we do later learn that part of what's going on there is that sometime when he was ashore at Nantucket before they set off again, he slipped or something, and the leg hit him in the groin. And that is one of the reasons why he was not talking to anybody for several weeks into the voyage, which is a fascinating excuse to give for what otherwise seems like a bit of atmosphere of having Ahab not emerge until this momentous day.
Again, it's all this mysterious backstory, right? We know about him, but we don't, right?
Yeah.
And his name is telling us something about his doom, right? Like his fate. That's going to be a very, very dark one.
So I get the sense that a lot of traditional mainstream readings of this novel really focus on Ahab. That Ahab is seen as the reason you read this novel.
Which I totally don't get. I find Ahab very boring.
Yeah, that was exactly where I was going with this. I couldn't really get a beat on him.
No.
I thought
he's evil, he's crazy.
Okay. He's moody, it's cool. It's a good character, I guess. He's there. But, he disappears for dozens of chapters at a time, and that's fine. I'd rather hang out with the other people. So I don't really have a good sense as to why people did a sort of Ahab-focused reading of it.
I'd be really curious to hear somebody talk who understood the book mainly in terms of that plot, like the Ahab plot. I mean, because there must be people out there like that. Like you were saying before, the movie versions all make that as if that's the story. And I'm like, who cares?
Yeah, as if Ahab is somehow heroic in his monomaniacal approach to getting this thing done. Which, okay, but I don't know, that doesn't compel me nearly as much as the weirdness with Ishmael and Queequeg.
Yeah. I mean, I guess one way you could approach that would be to understand Ahab as Ahab understands himself as locked in this kind of mortal combat with the whale.
Right.
We've been talking about Ishmael relative to his spouse, Queequeg, right? And that relationship. So they're kind of a pair in some very deeply profound way that plays out in a bunch of different ways throughout the narrative. And Ahab is someone who understands himself not as a member of a family, right? He's got a young wife and a child back at home, right? He understands himself as locked in this antagonistic relationship with Moby Dick, as if Moby Dick is his counterpart. Which, you're like, wait, human animal, is that? But then we're constantly reminded throughout the book that this is a whale with intelligence and will and anger and fury, with good reason. So in a way, it kind of works.
We should think a bit about the character of Moby Dick as well as the other tentpole, I suppose, in this novel. It's interesting. I was a little surprised because I'd never read the back third of the book before. I was a little surprised about how little characterization Moby Dick is given beyond what people say of him or how he acts in that final fight, which doesn't seem like a fair way to take away what Moby Dick the whale is like. If you see what I mean.
Well, I think what's really important here is it's not just a question of us being invited to think there's subjectivity in this one whale. In the chapter, The Armada, right, we're led to understand that the whales all have this subjectivity. There's this beautiful passage that talks about the baby whales. Do you remember that? The chapter is called The Grand Armada. It says this: "But far beneath this wondrous world upon the surface, another and still stranger world met our eyes as we gazed over the side. For suspended in those watery vaults floated the forms of the nursing mothers of the whales, and those that by their enormous girth seemed shortly to become mothers. This lake, as I've hinted, was to a considerable depth exceedingly transparent, and as human infants while suckling will calmly and fixedly gaze away from the breast, as if leading two different lives at the time, and while yet drawing mortal nourishment be still spiritually feasting upon some unearthly reminiscence, even so did the young of these whales seem looking up toward us, but not at us, as if we were but a bit of gulf weed in their newborn sight." I mean, that whole chapter is amazing, but this moment in particular, because we're with the whales looking at the people and kind of blankly looking at them, kind of ignoring them, right? And it's a strange moment, right? Where we're invited to see the female whales as nursing mothers, and not just in this objective kind of way, but to see from the perspective of those infant whales that are nursing. And so, even though that's not a glimpse into the subjectivity of Moby Dick, it's a sense that there's this other world and there are these other beings in that world, and they look at us. right? And so Moby Dick's look is going to be one of rage, not a dispassionate kind of look like the baby whales are going to have here, but they're all looking at us. And so, so coming back to Ahab, which we were talking about before, I mean, I guess we can understand Ahab as focused on that world in a malevolent way, but engaging with that world not as a field to be plowed, but rather other being, right? I don't mean to make Ahab seem good. Ahab's awful, but he's interacting with that world, not like you milk cows or you till a field or you slaughter pigs or chickens, right? Or dig for oil or anything. He's not seeing that world that way. He doesn't care about getting oil to take back. He only cares about this mortal combat.
This is making me think about how throughout the novel, Moby Dick is not given subjectivity.
No.
He's attacked back when attacked.
And he's talked about.
And he's talked about and he's cited and he's feared, but he's never doing anything. And he stands as this unkillable thing out there, unconquerable thing out there, which is an insult to a monomaniacal god man like Ahab.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why it must be destroyed in order to return to what Ahab might understand as a natural order where he, God
He's
King,
the master.
Gets to be the master of anything he wants to be.
That's right.
Which makes me suspicious of people who are doing an Ahab-centric reading, that this is their dream.
Yeah,
this is a totally sensible position to have in the world.
No.
But ultimately, it's important that the whale not have its own subjectivity, because it needs to be kind of this alien outside thing that insists upon its outsideness in a way that is meant to frustrate Ahab, and also maybe the reader. I would have liked to have known a little bit more about what Moby Dick does on his days when he's not being attacked by some jerk.
But this is the strange thing about Ishmael, right? There are a number of these moments, whether it's looking at the infant whales and seeing and not seeing the people, or when there's that wonderful analogy in the chapter that's called Brit, where in the same way that the whalers are on the water harvesting the abundance, right, of the whales and their oil, so too the whales are out there harvesting. There's this weird opening of that chapter called Brit, where it says, as morning mowers who side by side slowly and seethingly advance their sides through the long wet grass of marshy meads, even so these monsters swam, making a strange grassy cutting sound and leaving behind this endless swaths of blue upon the yellow sea. But it was only the sounds they made that parted the Brit, which at all reminded one of mowers. Seen from the mastheads, their vast black forms looked more like lifeless masses of rock than anything else. So it's a very strange moment where you see them twice. You see them first as mowers, right? They're harvesting, right? Like the men are harvesting, right? But if you look at it up from the masthead, which is where you look when you call out the whales so you can attack them, right? They're rocks, right? So they're mowers like us, or they're rocks. Right? So it's these double vision moments, right? Where the whales could be they could be subjects. Right? I don't think that's a 21st century projection back. I think that potentiality is there. Something like in the same way we were talking about the relationship between Ishmael and Queequeg, right? On the one hand, there's a way of domesticating and controlling it, like, oh, Queequeg said we're married, but that really means we're just best buds, right? Or here with the whales, they're like subjects. Oh, no, they're like rocks. Right? It's like the possibility of something different is there over and over again. And when we think, to come back to something we were talking about earlier about race and racialization in Moby Dick, the potentiality in that book is there too. It's one of the reasons why it's been written so eloquently about, I think, in terms of possibilities that Melville opens. He doesn't pursue them maybe, but he opens them and then they get taken up by other writers.
So let's talk about some of the different writers who have been influenced by Moby Dick and what they've done with it, where they've taken this work into interesting new directions. Yeah,
there's so many different frameworks to put the book in, right? One of the contexts in which it gets talked about is like the American Renaissance as a kind of a 19th century kind of movement, where if you look at it, it's like these, very canonical white male authors. And there's some interesting things to say about that, but there's an awful lot that's left unsaid when you have that conversation. There's also a way of talking about this book in connection with modernism. We already alluded to it getting its recognition only in the years beginning after World War I, when modernism as a movement kind of emerges voyages and recognizes retrospectively Moby Dick as somehow part of its genealogy, right? So that's a couple frames of reference. But the other frame of reference, and I think this is so fascinating, is the ways in which Black writers have picked up Melville and opened up space inside him to do things. We saw something a little bit like that happening with Whitman, too. And we talked about Langston Hughes and other writers engaging with Whitman's poetry, but even more with Melville. We talked today about like the spaces of possibility that get opened up with regard to sexuality and also with regard to race and racialization, where possibility is there, it might get closed down, but possibility is there. Also with the animal and the human, too, right? Possibility is there and then it gets closed down. And that creates a space that then other writers climb into. I was reading this fantastic essay a little while ago by Paul Gilroy, his Holberg Prize lecture from this year, and he does this incredibly beautiful reading, and we don't have time to do justice to it. It's an amazing thing. I urge you to read it. But one of the things he says is he brings out the ways in which a watery kind of literature, a pelagic reading allows us to think about Melville as a kind of middle point in a whole range of writing about the sea and the possibilities for humanity that we can think through the sea, right? So he talks about Olaudah Equiano. He talks about Melville. He talks about responses to Melville by C.L.R. James, Richard Wright, Ralph Ellison. And he says that Melville's work might have been so influential, he says, among mid-20th century Black Atlantic radicals, because he says Melville showed them that the racial nomos was implicated in the doom of Atlantic, that is, Western humankind. In other words, Melville makes that all visible in ways that get unpacked in this profound kind of way. For example, by having, he says, Captain Ahab speculate pointedly about the commercial value of a slave boy calculated against that of a whale. And he kind of unpacks the ways in which the economy of slavery is there in this imminent kind of way in Melville's text. And then it gets opened up by all these other writers and taken in all these other directions that both offer a devastating critique of the system of slavery, but also open up spaces for possibility, for human possibility. And Gilroy, evokes this in a really powerful way. Anyway, so there's a lot to say about that. It's something I hope we maybe get a chance to talk about more.
So how does Moby Dick resonate with these other texts about America that we've been reading?
Yeah, I've been thinking about that.
I found it very striking to read it immediately after the autobiography of Malcolm X, because that gave me such a strong lens to read anything through these questions of race. And in the way that Ishmael and others engage with non-white peoples and how they take their whiteness for granted, even while they make motions to say, well, it's all what's inside that counts.
Yeah, exactly.
Is really striking. And Malcolm X helped underline that through this reading for me. Made it impossible
to ignore.
Yeah, exactly. But it's also interesting to think about some of this encyclopedism with regard to Whitman and his cataloging and his listing of the different people. There's a sense in which Melville also takes this approach of let's have one of each kind, or one of many different kinds anyways, and bring them together and see what happens. But it's more complicated in some ways when he does it, because it's not just the ecstasy of an America where we're all engaged in the same project. Usually it's a lot more.
Well, it's also because
nuanced.
Melville knows something about the mercantile aspect, right? He's thinking about money. He's thinking about money all the time, right? Value all the time in a way that Whitman largely does not allow himself to do. So it shows up in all different kinds of places. That lovely phrase, time, strength, cash, and patience, right?
Right.
Cash, right? And so over and over again, we're reminded about the value of the cargo that's being accrued over the period when the whales are being slaughtered and tried out, right? And the other thing that Melville does is not just he's thinking about the cash, thinking about the money, thinking about the value, but he explicitly yokes that, again, in a playful and comic way, to colonialism. There's this wonderful moment when he's laying out for us the distinction between a fast fish and a loose fish. So if there's another whaler out there and they haven't really properly secured a whale that they've caught, you can take it under certain circumstances, right? The whole fast fish, loose fish distinction. And he says in this sort of aside, America in 1492 was a loose fish. Right. And it's a way of saying playfully that like anybody could have grabbed it and whoever grabbed it is entitled to it because, that's just the law of the sea. But it's also kind of awful, right? Because we're aware too of the terrible cost and violence that goes along with that. So he's going to yoke the financial gain to exploration and colonialism using the language of whaling.
Well, and similarly, that ends with, and what at last will Mexico be to the United States? And there's a sense of that, there's real consequences for what's going on right now.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the aspects that we haven't talked about much, I wish there's so much more that we could talk about, is indigenous people, right? Like not just Queequeg, who comes from a far distant area, but Tashtego and some of the other people who are also on the Pequot are Native Americans, right? Indians, he'll call them. But they come not just from the Americas, they come from Nantucket. Right. And the ship itself, the Pequot, is named after the Native American tribe that had been out on Cape Cod, but had been exterminated long since. Right. So they're there and not there. Like, so when we think about the loose fish of America, the cost, right, the human cost of the loose fish is there. It's there as a space to think about, but we don't quite go there.
Yeah. And it's not clear to me what Melville's take on a lot of these specific policies or history is.
No.
But he is at least bringing it up. It is in the mix.
He's going to show it to you. He's not going to take you there, right? And he's not going to be explicit, but he's going to show it to you. And it's up to you if you see it or not.
Well, we could easily talk about this book for another 3 or 4 hours.
All day.
We could start a whole other podcast about this, although there are other Moby Dick podcasts are available. But yeah.
But we can't.
Mm. Next time around, we're going to be switching to a completely different theme. It's going to be about the watery ocean.
Yeah, completely different, not completely different.
We're going to be starting off with Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, and then reading William Shakespeare's The Tempest, and then ending with The Odyssey by Homer.
Ending and beginning, right? In all kinds of ways.
Well, ending this chapter.
Yeah.
This cluster, yes. But in the meantime, if any of our listeners want to get in touch with us, you can email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm, or we're on Twitter @thespouter. Show notes with links for anything we've mentioned in this episode are at megaphonic.fm/spouter/12, and the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. So until next time,
we'll see you again at the Spouter-Inn.